Example of data model configuration in BIZUIT. Welcome! In this video, we'll walk through a practical example of configuring the data model for a process using our refund management workflow. We'll begin by defining the input parameters, both mandatory and optional, and the output parameters. Let's go to the parameters section and create as many as needed. In our case, we'll define the following mandatory scalar parameters: employee number, expense date, set as a scalar of type date. Expense amount, which will be a scalar of type double. Expense reason, also mandatory. We'll also include an optional parameter: expense location. Additionally, we'll create a new output parameter to represent the process result. Indicating whether the request was approved or not. These mandatory and optional input parameters will be available for use in the startup form, which we'll see later on. Now, let's define the process variables. Process variables are internal data points used to configure logic within the workflow, based on what's happening at each step. For example, we need to store the result from evaluating the external human resources service to determine if the request complies with the reimbursement policy. We'll create a variable named complies with policy. Which could store an integer, 04 does not comply and 14 complies. We'll also need a variable to capture the data entered by the administration team during the initial evaluation, such as the decision outcome and any notes or comments. It's a good practice to use an XML document type variable for each screen in the process. So, we'll create a variable called vData initial evaluation. Instead of using separate scalar variables for the result and notes, we'll encapsulate them in one XML document, which will simplify structure and handling. With these elements in place, we now have a solid data model configuration that supports the logic of our refund process. We'll now define the schema. When creating an XML schema, it must always start with a root element. In this case, the root will be called vInitialDataValuation, and it will contain an element named result, with a data type of integer. Representing values 0 or 1. and a note element of type string to include evaluation comments. This structure becomes our XSD schema. If we already have an XSD file, we can import it using the Import option. Click OK, then Accept, and that's it. We now have our XML document type variable ready to store the information entered through this screen. Among the data we'll capture here is the result. This will let us determine if the request was approved or rejected by evaluating the result node inside the vInitialDataValuation variable. Now, let's do the same for the Administrative Manager evaluation screen. We'll create a new variable named vDataAuthorizationAdminManager. Which will also be of XML document type. Its root node will be called DataAuthManager, and it will contain a result element of type int, 0 or 1. And a note element of type string. In addition, we'll need to know whether the expiration condition was met. That is, whether the maximum deadline for the initial evaluation was exceeded. So we can decide if the flow should follow the expired path. To track this, we'll create a new variable called vExpired, which will be of type integer. Lastly, we may also consider defining another document type variable for the Administrative Manager evaluation screen. But we'll see that this won't be necessary once we refactor the process design.